In Pyongyang, power does not announce itself with noise. It settles quietly into architecture, into seating arrangements, into the measured distance between men standing beneath portraits of the Kim dynasty. The capital of North Korea was designed to reflect permanence: wide boulevards, monumental stone facades, and a skyline that feels less commercial than ideological. Within this carefully curated landscape, status is invisible to outsiders, but unmistakable to those raised inside it. Rank determines where you live, what you eat, what schools your children attend, and how closely the state watches your breathing. It was within this calibrated hierarchy that Thae Yong-ho built his life. To understand the significance of his eventual defection, it is necessary first to understand the machinery that shaped him. Thae was not an outsider to the system. He was a product of it, refined by it, entrusted by it. Rising through the ranks of the Workers' Party, and later the Foreign Ministry, he entered a tier of North Korean society few citizens ever glimpse. The path required ideological reliability, family background free from political blemish, and a disciplined performance of loyalty. Advancement did not simply reward competence, it measured devotion. Each promotion meant deeper proximity to the regime's inner logic and deeper entanglement in its expectations. By the time Thae was appointed deputy ambassador to the United Kingdom, he occupied a rare space in North Korea's diplomatic architecture. Diplomats are not merely representatives abroad, they are instruments of survival for a sanctioned state. They manage trade channels, cultivate influence, monitor defectors, and serve as eyes for Pyongyang in foreign capitals. Their families often remain partially tethered to the homeland, an unspoken insurance policy against betrayal. The position demands fluency, not only in language, but in perception. A diplomat must understand how North Korea is seen from the outside, and how that perception must be managed. Inside Pyongyang's political culture, such an appointment signified trust. The regime of Kim Jong-un had already consolidated power through purges and public demonstrations of authority. Loyalty was scrutinized more intensely than ever. Senior officials disappeared abruptly, victims of factional suspicion or perceived disloyalty. For those who remained, survival required composure. To operate at Thae's level meant mastering the art of silence, knowing what not to question, what not to linger on, and when to express unwavering affirmation. Yet privilege in North Korea carries its own weight. High-ranking officials live in better apartments, receive imported goods, and enjoy access to controlled information streams. But access is never freedom. Telephones are monitored. Travel is restricted. Even within elite circles, conversation bends around invisible boundaries. Power is accompanied by scrutiny, and scrutiny produces a particular psychological climate, one in which ambition and anxiety coexist. Thae's early career unfolded within this atmosphere of disciplined performance. He studied, served, and adapted. Like many diplomats, he was exposed to fragments of the outside world through briefings and state-sanctioned media. But exposure abroad is different. In London, the contrast was not theoretical. It was immediate and ambient. Supermarkets overflowed with goods. Newspapers criticized their own government openly. Universities hosted debates that would be unthinkable in Pyongyang. The world outside North Korea did not appear chaotic, it appeared self-correcting. Still, diplomats are trained to contextualize such differences. They are instructed to interpret foreign prosperity as imperial advantage, foreign criticism as decadence, and foreign freedoms as instability disguised as choice. For years, they operated within that interpretive framework. He hosted events at the embassy, defended the regime's policies, and maintained communication with superiors in Pyongyang. His role required composure, and he delivered it. But proximity to alternative systems introduces a quiet tension. It does not erupt overnight. It accumulates. Watching his children integrate into British schools, observing their questions and curiosities, introduced a dimension of doubt that ideological briefings could not easily suppress. The regime's narrative depended on containment, on limiting comparison. London offered constant comparison. Meanwhile, the political climate at home grew sharper. Under Kim Jong-un, high-level purges became more visible. Senior figures, once considered untouchable, were publicly denounced. The message was unmistakable. Rank did not guarantee safety. For officials stationed abroad, this intensified a latent fear. Distance from Pyongyang provided comfort, but it also invited suspicion. A diplomat too comfortable overseas could be recalled. A recall was not always administrative, it could be terminal. The psychological cost of this balancing act deepened. To remain loyal required compartmentalization, separating personal observation from political duty. It required convincing oneself that contradictions were temporary, that reform would emerge internally, that the system's severity served a higher purpose. Yet the longer they remained in London, the harder that separation became. Exposure to open discourse, to uncensored information, and to a society where authority could be questioned without disappearance began to reshape his internal calculus. This transformation was not dramatic. There was no singular moment of revelation. It was gradual, almost procedural. A conversation overheard. A newspaper article read without restriction. A child's question about history that could not be answered with slogans. Each instance eroded certainty by a fraction. Doubt in authoritarian systems is rarely explosive. It is cumulative. At the same time, the stakes of doubt were immense. Defection at his level would not be interpreted as personal choice. It would be framed as betrayal. The consequences would extend beyond him, touching colleagues, extended family, and networks still inside North Korea. The regime's reliance on collective responsibility ensured that decisions reverberated widely. For a man raised within its structures, loyalty was not abstract. It was interwoven with identity. As deputy ambassador, they understood both the value of information and the risks of miscalculation. He knew how Pyongyang analyzed defection cases. He knew how intelligence services operated. This awareness sharpened the internal debate. To remain meant safety through conformity. To question meant stepping outside the only architecture he had ever known. By the mid-2010s, the equilibrium he had maintained for decades began to feel less stable. Political tightening in Pyongyang, combined with increasing exposure to open society in London, narrowed his psychological margin. The privileges of rank no longer compensated for the pressure of surveillance and the moral strain of representation. High office had given him proximity to power, but had also given him perspective. In North Korea, power is designed to appear immovable. It projects inevitability. Yet from the vantage point of a diplomat abroad, inevitability can begin to look conditional. Systems that once seemed permanent reveal seams. For Thae Yong-ho, those seams were not immediately pathways to escape. They were questions, quiet, persistent, and increasingly difficult to ignore. By the time Thae Yong-ho had settled into his role as deputy ambassador in London, his life existed in two parallel realities. One was structured, familiar, and disciplined. The world of cables sent back to Pyongyang, policy briefings, and carefully worded statements defending the leadership of Kim Jong-un. The other unfolded more quietly, in grocery stores lined with abundance, in evening news broadcasts that criticized their own government, and in classrooms where his children encountered ideas without ideological framing. The contrast did not announce itself as rebellion. It presented itself as friction. Diplomatic service had always required exposure to foreign systems, but this posting was different in duration and depth. In London, the outside world was not filtered through controlled briefings. It was ambient. It surrounded him in architecture, in media, in conversation overheard on public transport. For years, they had interpreted foreign prosperity through the ideological lens he had been trained to apply. Wealth was evidence of imperial history. Social freedoms were symptoms of moral looseness. Political disagreement was instability masquerading as democracy. These interpretations had once felt coherent. Over time, coherence required effort. The erosion of certainty did not stem from a single revelation. It emerged through accumulation. Each day offered small contradictions. British officials who criticized their own prime minister were not arrested. Newspapers published investigations into government missteps without disappearing. University lectures debated the ethics of intervention and war openly. These were not abstract observations. They were lived experiences, visible to his children and impossible to unsee. At home, the atmosphere in Pyongyang grew less forgiving. Reports filtered outward of high-level purges and sudden executions. Senior officials, some of whom they had encountered during his years in the foreign ministry, were removed abruptly. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty was not a static achievement, but a daily performance subject to re-evaluation. Distance from the capital did not insulate him from that reality. In some respects, it intensified the pressure. Diplomats abroad operated under suspicion precisely because they witnessed alternatives. Within the embassy, discipline remained rigid. Communications with Pyongyang were methodical and encrypted. Visits from senior envoys were formal and watchful. Subtle reminders of accountability were embedded in routine. Families of diplomats were both companions and collateral, their presence abroad offering comfort, but also serving as leverage. The regime's architecture of control extended beyond borders. The psychological strain lay in managing incompatible truths. They understood the state's argument for centralized power. He had internalized it through decades of service. The narrative of external threat, of historical grievance, of survival against hostile forces had shaped his worldview. Yet living in London complicated that narrative. The society around him did not appear hostile in the ways he had been taught to expect. It appeared complex, imperfect, but self-correcting. His children's education sharpened this tension. They asked questions not framed by loyalty tests. They encountered histories that did not center on Pyongyang. Their aspirations began to reflect possibilities that did not exist within the controlled pathways of North Korea. Watching them adapt, he confronted a calculation he had long postponed. Advancement within the regime guaranteed status and security, but it also predetermined the contours of their future. The outside world, with all its unpredictability, offered latitude. Fear accompanied these reflections. Defection at his level would not be interpreted as personal doubt. It would be framed as betrayal of the state and the supreme leader. The consequences would ripple outward. Extended family members remaining in North Korea could face investigation or punishment. Former colleagues would be questioned. The decision could not be compartmentalized as individual. It was collective in impact. At the same time, remaining carried its own risk. Political tides in Pyongyang shifted unpredictably. A recall could arrive without explanation. A misinterpreted report, an unguarded remark, or a perceived softness toward Western counterparts could trigger suspicion. For diplomats abroad, ambiguity was dangerous. Success required constant calibration, appearing effective without appearing influenced. The erosion of loyalty therefore unfolded not as defiance, but as analysis. They weighed probabilities with the mindset of a career official. He assessed the regime's trajectory under Kim Jong-un, noting the intensification of control and the consolidation of personal authority. He evaluated his own standing, considering how proximity to foreign society might be perceived. He examined his children's prospects if returned to Pyongyang, where their years abroad could invite scrutiny. Private deliberations replaced ideological certainty. Evenings once spent reviewing cables acquired a second layer of reflection. Ordinary activities, walking through London streets, observing political rallies, watching televised parliamentary debates, became case studies in alternative governance. The outside world was not utopian, it was flawed and contentious. But it functioned without the omnipresent fear that structured life back home. This gradual accumulation of contrast reshaped his internal hierarchy of values. Stability had once meant obedience within a closed system. Now stability appeared differently, the ability to question authority without vanishing, to pursue opportunity without predetermined classification. The transformation was subtle enough to remain invisible externally. Publicly, he continued to perform his duties with composure. Privately, the calculus shifted. Information played a decisive role. Access to uncensored media and first-hand diplomatic briefings offered a broader understanding of how North Korea was perceived globally. Sanctions tightened. International isolation deepened. The regime's strategy seemed increasingly dependent on nuclear leverage rather than economic reform. For a man trained to think in terms of long-term viability, these patterns raised concerns. The promise of gradual internal change appeared less plausible. Still, the threshold between doubt and action remained formidable. Defection required coordination, secrecy, and trust in foreign intelligence services. It required accepting that return would be impossible. It required reconciling personal survival with the likely suffering of those left behind. These were not impulsive considerations. They demanded prolonged contemplation. As months passed, the psychological balance tipped incrementally. Loyalty no longer felt synonymous with duty. It felt synonymous with stagnation. The environment in London, with its openness and unpredictability, ceased to feel alien. It began to feel instructive. The decision forming in his mind did not carry the energy of rebellion. It carried the weight of inevitability. By 2016, the convergence of factors, intensified purges in Pyongyang, growing suspicion toward overseas officials, and his children's integration into British life, compressed the margin for delay. The choice crystallized, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in quiet resolve. Years within the system had taught him patience, analysis, and caution. Those same qualities now guided him toward departure. The transformation from loyal diplomat to defector was not abrupt. It was the cumulative result of exposure, fear, responsibility, and reasoned judgment. When the decision finally settled, it felt less like a leap into the unknown and more like the logical conclusion of years spent reconciling two incompatible realities. The decision, once made, did not feel explosive. It felt procedural. For Thae Yong-ho, years inside the disciplined architecture of North Korea had conditioned him to think in stages, contingencies, and outcomes. Defection was not an emotional gesture, it was an operation. Every variable carried consequence. Every misstep carried the possibility of repatriation, interrogation, and collective punishment extending far beyond himself. London in the summer of 2016 appeared unchanged. Diplomatic receptions continued. Embassy communications flowed through secure channels. British officials maintained formal courtesies. Yet beneath the routine, calculations were underway. Contact with British authorities required absolute discretion. Surveillance, both perceived and real, shadowed every movement. North Korean embassies abroad operate as extensions of Pyongyang's internal security culture. Colleagues were not merely co-workers, they were observers, each responsible for reporting irregularities. The margin for error was narrow. The plan unfolded methodically. Timing mattered. The presence of his family complicated logistics, but clarified purpose. Their departure could not resemble panic. It had to appear administrative, routine, unremarkable. The very skills that had advanced his diplomatic career, measured speech, emotional restraint, awareness of protocol, now shielded him from suspicion. Years of performance had prepared him for this final act of concealment. When the moment arrived, it was quiet. There were no dramatic confrontations inside embassy corridors, no visible rupture. Instead, there was absence. A car ride not returning to its origin. Communications unanswered. Within hours, Pyongyang understood what had occurred. For the regime, a deputy ambassador's disappearance was not merely a personal betrayal. It was an intelligence breach. A man entrusted with strategy, messaging, and internal assessments had crossed into the custody of a foreign power. British authorities moved swiftly but discreetly. Initial debriefings focused on security, verification of identity, assessment of immediate threats, evaluation of potential retaliation. The process was clinical. Intelligence officers required precision, not emotion. What did he know about diplomatic funding networks? What insights could he offer into decision-making circles in Pyongyang? What vulnerabilities existed within overseas missions? Information replaced ideology as the currency of his value. Soon after, arrangements were made for transfer to South Korea. The journey itself was controlled and largely unseen by the public. Upon arrival, the environment shifted from British caution to South Korean scrutiny. High-ranking defectors are rare, and their knowledge carries strategic weight. Debriefings extended for weeks, sometimes months, covering everything from elite family structures to internal propaganda strategies. The questions were exhaustive, repetitive, and necessary. Meanwhile, in Pyongyang, the response was predictable and severe. State media denounced him as a criminal and a traitor. Official statements reframed his defection as corruption or personal misconduct. The regime's survival depends on narrative control. Acknowledging ideological doubt at his level would suggest vulnerability. Instead, the story was reconstructed to preserve inevitability. Loyalty had not eroded, he had been morally compromised. The message served two purposes: discourage imitation and reaffirm internal cohesion. For they, exile began not with celebration but with containment. South Korea's resettlement protocols for high-profile defectors involved protection and isolation. Security personnel monitored threats. Intelligence agencies continued structured interviews. Public appearances were delayed until assessments concluded. Freedom, when it arrived, felt procedural rather than euphoric. Movement was permitted, but visibility carried risk. The psychological adjustment was more complex than the logistical one. For decades, his identity had been inseparable from the state he represented. Now, that identity was publicly reversed. He was no longer a defender of policy, but a critic of it. Media outlets sought interviews. Analysts requested commentary on leadership dynamics under Kim Jong-un. Each appearance required careful calibration. He possessed insider knowledge, but disclosure carried consequences for those still inside North Korea. The burden of testimony was heavier than anticipated. In Seoul, the pace of life differed from both Pyongyang and London. It was faster, commercially saturated, technologically relentless. Integration demanded adaptation to systems he had once described only from briefing papers. Banking, telecommunications, even casual social interactions required unlearning habits formed under surveillance. The absence of constant monitoring felt disorienting at first. Freedom introduced its own uncertainty.